Do we have any prayer requests this morning? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Yes, sir.
Larry's hard. He had the blockage, and they think it's opened up. Maybe he's home, but I think he's got to go back to his doctor Monday. They let him out of the hospital.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. George, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Sure. Let's pray. Holy Father in heaven, we come to you this morning, this beautiful day that you've given us, Father. We just thank you for every blessing of life. We thank you for this opportunity which allows us to assemble freely as your children, Father, to open your holy word, to study it, to meditate on it, draw strength from it, Father, and to grow closer to one another, and most importantly, Father, to grow closer to you.
Um, yes. Oh, okay. If you didn't hear that, Joanne has COVID. And those numbers, I was at Providence Hospital visiting my dad yesterday, and they have a COVID board up, and the number was at 5. So, anyway, it's definitely around us again. Hopefully, we'll be able to contain it better than we did last time. So in your Bibles, I would like for you to turn to Malachi chapter 4, and verse 6. Now, flip a page. Scott, read that page for me.
Mine's blank.
It's blank. How can it be blank? Did God not do anything during that time?
It goes from blank to the New Testament.
So was God absent during that 400-year period? I might disagree with that, but he certainly did not. There were certainly no prophets in that time. What I want to talk about for the next 4 weeks is the influences on the book of Matthew from the intertestamental time. And we tend to think that, God was away. God's people didn't, there were no God's people, or there were very few God's people, and that 400-year period just kind of went away. They were in exile. They came back to Jerusalem, and for 400 years, God did nothing. And that's really not the case. We're going to read about some scriptures, or I guess they're scriptures. They're going to be out of 1st and 2nd Maccabees that tell that God was tremendously active with his people during this time. Tremendously active. Now, the time frame that we're talking about with the Maccabees is about 160 AD. These would have been books that the Jews would have had. These would have been, or not, maybe not books, but maybe scrolls or whatever. But these would have been information that Jesus would have read, that would have been taught. These would have been things that the Jewish people knew about. And that's why it's important, that's why I think it's important that we just touch on this error so that we understand more about what happened in the first century. Oftentimes what happens is we read the Bible in a 21st century viewpoint. And when we read it in a 21st century viewpoint, what we lose is the color of the Bible. So when we read the Bible from our viewpoint, what we read is just black and white. There is no color. In fact, it's probably gray. And people all the time misrepresent the Bible because they don't understand the 21st century, the first century context. There are numerous examples of that, and we're going to talk about many of those over the next 4 weeks. But one of those is one of my favorites is judge that you be not judged. Now we're going to say, we like to say, well, don't judge me because only God can judge me. That is not what that verse is about, in my opinion. There are times we'll say, well, the disciples, when they're in there's a storm and Jesus is asleep in the boat, and the disciples are like, what's going on here? And we take that question that Jesus has at the end of that, and we go, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. The disciples didn't know Jesus. But if you switch that question to a statement, now all of a sudden it's like, hey, maybe they did know. And the thing that is most important about that, and the reason why I think we give the disciples too hard of a time for not knowing which way Jesus wanted to go, was that from the age of 5, and we'll talk about this probably next week, but just to give you a little teaser, from the age of 5 to the age of 10, they would have spent time in a school where they would have learned the Torah. By the age of 13, they would have, or 12 or 13, they would have memorized the Torah, and they would be able to, when their rabbi started teaching or started reading scripture and he stopped, they would be able to pick up from that point and go forward. So when we say that the disciples didn't know what was going on, that's a total misnomer. We are totally thinking about the Bible from a 21st century perspective and not a first century perspective. So, the intertestamental period, or the whatever period, I get tongue-tied on some of these, so you'll have to excuse me. I can say it fine when I'm at home by myself in front of the mirror, making sure I look good, but when I get in front of people, I lose it. There we go. Deuterocanonical. So before like 1800s, it was very common to have some of the apocryphal books in our Bible, in what we would consider to be the Christian Bible. After about 1800, those books tended to go away, because we called that they were not part of they were not considered to be inspired. And we can talk about why they're inspired or why they're not inspired or why they should be inspired. It's really a different conversation. But this period is the beginnings of the Jews. Really kind of goes back into like 589 when the Jews were exiled, and then in 519 when they came back to Jerusalem. And they came back slowly over a period of time. They just didn't come back in one mass group. One of the things that's interesting to talk about is that when they were exiled, they only took the strong Jews or the healthy Jews or the Jews who were able to work. They left the poor and the sick there. So we see that kind of dimension coming back in the Old Testament when they do come back, and there's like, well, where have you been? Well, we were exiled. Why are you still here? And that gets into the whole Samaritan and Jewish beginnings there. This period is the first establishment of the synagogues. The Jews had to have needed some place to worship. And because they were not in Jerusalem, they started building synagogues. This becomes very important until about 70 something BC, when the Jews rebuilt the temple again, and then it lasts for about 140 years until the temple was destroyed again, and then the synagogues really came to have a more pronouncement in worship. Change of language from Hebrew to Aramaic and Hellenistic Greek. And we don't really talk about that a whole bunch, but that was a really huge change, because you had a group of people, God's people, who spoke, it's gonna be a long day, who spoke Hebrew. And in fact, it was pretty much God's language, if you will, just like it was God's people. And the effect of Hellenism and Alexander the Great had much to do with that change, because the Jews stopped learning Hebrew. Or at least if they didn't stop learning Hebrew, it wasn't as important to them as it was before. So again, there is a huge shift. That the Jews that came in the exile were not the same Jews that came out of the exile. They were not the same Jews that entered in the first century. And in fact, after AD 70, they weren't the same Jews after AD 70. So there's this shift that happens to God's people because of the historical events, even before the exile, but certainly afterwards, after the exile. Another important thing that happens is the Maccabean period. And I'm going to read a little bit just to give you a taste of what was going on in those times. The reign of the Hasmoneans and the Herodian dynasties. One of the things that that I found very interesting about Herod, both father and son, is that Herod owned the spice trade. And there's a city called Petra, and that was Herod's city. And if you go look at, if you go Google Petra, you'll see it's the city that's kind of carved out in stone. That's Herod's. Now, the reason that's important is because it is estimated that Herod made about 800 talents a year off the spice trade. The GDP, if you will, of Rome was 80 talents. So the reason that's important, and we know that Herod had, he at least had a Jewish mother. Now, whether he was like, I had a boss that said, well, he was a Jew, but he wasn't a synagogue Jew, which means he was born Jewish, he just didn't go to synagogue. So scholars think that that's kind of the way Herod was. But what's important about that is we know that in about 40 years before Christ, which would be 40 BC, Herod and the Jews, the Jewish leadership, the high priest, were like, if we don't do something, Rome is going to take us over, and we're going to lose everything that we have. So how do we fix that problem? Well, you got Herod, who has all of this money. He's a businessman. He's not a king yet. He's got all of this money, and they go, well, what does Rome need? They need money. And what do we have? We have money. So they get Herod to be the king of the Jews, which we'll talk about in about 4 weeks. They get Herod to be the king of the Jews. And so they go to Rome and say, hey, look, we have found a leader, and he is Herod. And the Romans go, great, we need money. And so that's how that relationship between the Jews, Herod, and Rome happened. Had nothing to do with religion. The Jews actually, the Sanhedrin, or the Sadducees, which those are different groups, sold out to the Romans so they could keep what they had, which was power and a political leadership. Yeah. The production of the Septuagint happened here, the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't talk about it a lot. And there's nothing been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that says anything different to what we already know in the Bible. But what the Dead Sea Scrolls do is they confirm the lifestyle and the Bible to us. So it just verifies over and over again that Jesus is Lord, that the Bible is real, that it's not some made-up book, because there is a virtually full copy of the Bible as we know it, with all the different books, that has been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Another interesting thing, and I don't know if you heard about this, but about maybe a month or two ago, they actually, archaeologists actually excavated the Pool of Siloam, which is where, Jesus had a healing of leprosy. Why is that important? We always knew that he did it. I mean, if you believe the Bible and have faith, I mean, it's a no question that Jesus did that. But now we can actually pinpoint that location, where it happened and what it looked like, which just further adds to our belief that, that did happen, that the Bible is not made up as some people would like to tell us that it is.
Dave,
Yes.
based talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, what about the Book of Enoch?
So I like the Book of Enoch is, I've read the Book of Enoch.
I mean, in my opinion, it has almost everything in it that Deuteronomy has in it.
Yes.
it is as accurate as the book of Deuteronomy is.
You know, I think one of the reasons that it's not included, and I think one of the reasons a lot of these books, now obviously there are apocryphal books that say, you know, Jesus killed a bird and then he made it rise again or whatever, you know. But many of those books have a lot of information that the Jews of that time would have known about. And I think Enoch, for a number of reasons, it's one of those books that's kind of out there. And it's, you know, there's talks about creation and, you know, a lot of other things. And I think that whoever, when they put the Bible together, they were like, oh, this is just too much. That's my personal opinion. And we can't have it. But it is a very interesting book to read. It's a very scientific book.
It is.
Very scientific, way ahead of its time.
And really, honestly, I can't understand why it was not included in the canon and included in the Bible.
I think it's too controversial. I think it was too controversial for the time. I think it's probably too controversial. I mean, we would, I think they were just like this it can't.
I mean, like you
Can't
said,
go on.
It went over everything. It told about the creation. It told about Babel.
Mm-hmm.
It told, you know, about Abraham, the children of Israel. It gives detail of everything. But yet, it was not included in the Bible. And to me, I think they missed out when they didn't put that in the Bible.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you talk about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which I'm going to read a little bit here in a minute, I feel the same way about that. Have you read those? No. You know, with 1st and 2nd Maccabees, what you basically see, it's basically 1st and 2nd Kings without a prophet. That's what the 1st and 2nd Maccabees is about.
Well, in Kings is nothing more than just, you know,
basically a series of wars.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you love war elephants and other war type technologies, I mean, 1st and 2nd Maccabees that's where it's at. It's a great read. It's not, you know, it's not tremendously long. You can download it free off the internet. It's a great read. My uncle-in-law back there, my favorite uncle-in-law.
Yeah, I'm your only.
Well, okay.
uncle-in-law. If you want to read some of these, get your hands a hold of a Catholic Bible.
Yeah.
A lot of these books are included in their Bible, and you can read them. But we have to trust that the founding fathers who wrote and approved the Bible, they were far closer to the truth and the origins. And if they decided against it for whatever reason, there has to have a good reason. It's like the Book of Thomas and some of the other books. They didn't come into 200 years after Christ's death. And so
Right.
some of these books you won't have because they simply never saw them. And if the ones that did see them in one of the committees or whatever you care to call it, they would not approve of it for whatever reason because they were closer to the truth.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes the Maccabees kind of different is that 2nd Maccabees is really a historical book that is written in that time. 1st Maccabees is kind of a prefix or an introduction, and was written about 30 years later. So, you know, I fully understand your point, and I agree with you. I have no problem. You know, we're not going to get in. I don't want to get into a canon argument about what should be there and what shouldn't be there. Yes, sir.
You've got the Council of Nicaea, you've got others that meet, decide what's canon, what is not. And we think of 325 AD as ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
But for them, that was modern times, and they're looking at ancient scriptures. And I hate to say it, but I think like some of their prejudices and, things that they did in the Roman church or didn't want in the Roman church, played a part in it. They even got to a point down the road where they had to split with what's not called the Orthodox.
Right. Exactly.
People are hard-headed, they're gonna have it their way, to some degree, and things that offended them or made the Jews look too good got kicked out.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Very good point. All right. So I think my next slide is to. So I just want to give you a taste. I'm reading from 1 Maccabees, 1st chapter, verse 41. Moreover, King Archelaus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. Now, Archelaus is not a good guy. All right, you're going to see that in a minute, so bear with me. And everyone should leave his laws, that's talking about the Jewish law, so that all heathen should agree according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should all follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings, sacrifice, drink offerings in the temple, and they should profane the Sabbath and the festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and the holy people, and set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, sacrifice swine, flesh, and unclean beasts. And they should leave their children uncircumcised, and they should make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanity, to the end that they may forget the law and change all the ordinances, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he says he should die. And in the selfsame manner wrote he to his whole kingdom and the appointers of overseers of all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city. And many of the people were gathered unto them, and to wit, every one that forsake the law, and so that they committed evils in the land, and drove the Israelites to secret places, even wheresoever they could flee from. And on the 15th day of the month, in some month I cannot pronounce, in the year 145th year, they set up abomination to the desolation upon the altar, built idol altars throughout the city of Judah on every side, and burnt incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they had found, they burnt them with fire. And whosoever was found with a book of the testament, or if any committed to the law, the king's commandment was they should be put to death. And this they did by the authority of the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. Now on the 5th and 25th day of the month, they did sacrifices upon the idol altars, which were upon the altar of God. And at the time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their neck, rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them.
Can you tell me where that, I know it's in verse Matthew, what was the scripture?
Chapter 1, verse 41. There was a whole lot going on to make during this time to God's people.
You sound like the Nazis.
You know, I didn't think about that, but it is very, very familiar.
You want to conquer a people and keep them conquered, make sure they're ignorant, make sure their children are raised in ignorance, destroy their culture through ignorance.
Yep.
And then you can do what you want.
Now, you know, I want to read one other section to you, and this is going to come out of 2 Maccabees. Chapter 7. And so starting at verse 1, I'll go through 8, and then I'm going to drop down to 36. And it came to pass that 7 brethren and their mother were taken and compelled by the king against the law to taste swine flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips. But one of them that spake first said this, what wouldest thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die rather than to transgress the laws of our fathers. And the king, same king, Archelaus, then the king came in the rage, commanded pans and cauldrons to be made hot, and forthwith being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongues to him that spake first, and to cut off the utmost parts of his body, and the rest of his brethren and his mother were looking on. Now when he was thus maimed in all of his members, he commanded him, being yet alive, to be brought to the fire and to be fried in the pan. And as the vapor of the pan was for a good space dispersed, they exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully, saying, the Lord is looking upon us, and in truth he hath comfort in us, as Moses in his song, which witnessed to their faces, declaring, saying, and he shall be comforted in his servants. So when the first was dead, after this number, they brought the second to make him a mocking stock. And when they had pulled the skin off his head with his hair, they asked him, wilt thou eat before thou be punished throughout every member of your body? And I love this part right here. And he answered in his own language and said, no. One of the things that I love about this, and we all have our favorite verses that we kind of rely on. And sometimes, it might be, something in the New Testament, maybe Romans or 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians or whatever. But my favorite verses come out of Job 38. And I love that's when God is answering these questions to Job, and Job is saying, God's saying, my favorite one is, who laid the foundations of the earth? Whenever I'm questioning something, I read that, and I'm like, wow, that's it. Who stored up the snow? And I love his answer. I mean, it is short and sweet and to the point. His brother has already been, every member of his body has been cut or maimed or cut off, or, just all this persecution. He has 7 brothers and a mother, and his brothers and mom say, stay the course. And he stays the course, and he dies because he knows that his salvation is found in heaven. And then they bring the next brother, and the next brother goes, same thing. And this happens to all 7 brothers. And if we skip down to verse 36, for our brethren who have now suffered in short pain, that's amazing. You're being boiled or cooked or flamed or, fingers cut off and all this kind of stuff, and that is short pain. Who now have suffered in short pain are dead under God's covenant and everlasting life. But thou, through the judgment of God, shall receive just punishment for your pride. Everybody, all the 8 of those people died. But the thing about it is they knew God. So when we talk about this 400-year period and we say, hey, you know, nothing happened, God was silent, if you read through the Maccabees, you will quickly understand that God was not silent. Now, there wasn't a prophet, and God didn't do like he did to the patriarchs and say, you know, talk to them, but he answered prayers. There are numerous examples in the Maccabees where they are literally outnumbered 10 or 20 to 1, and they win. And they win a bloody war. I mean, they are in hand-to-hand combat, and they win. So it's an amazing study about how God, even though there were not prophets, even though there were not the other facilities that we read about in the Old Testament, God was still taking care of his people. So, Matthew, who was Matthew?
Tax collector and prophet.
Okay. So, Matthew, a little bit about Matthew. He was a Jew, obviously. He was a tax collector. He was called by Jesus. He was probably older. And he was probably, in fact, we know that he was older because he had a job that was outside of the family. Because a tax collector would not be like a family job. Your father wouldn't train you to be a tax collector. And there's no mention of his family. Now, when we think of tax collectors, we think of, in our 21st century worldview, when we think of tax collectors, what we think about is the IRS. And for the most part, the IRS is a nondescript building in Washington that we send off papers to that we hate to send off to pay taxes. It was much more personal in the first century. And if you've watching the Chosen series, there is actually a scene where Matthew is in his booth collecting taxes. Now, there were a number of different things around this that really caused the Jews a lot of consternation. One of those things was there was this idea of collecting taxes. The Romans wanted people to work all the time. They didn't want them to take the Sabbath off. They didn't want them to, because the Romans were like, well, if you don't work, then we're missing out on taxes. So the Jews were under great pressure to continue to work on the Sabbath. And they would be punished for it if they didn't. The other thing, the best example that I can think of in our worldview of Matthew as a tax collector. So he was a Jew, and he was working for the Romans. The best example I can put on that to give you really kind of what he experienced was, if you were to in the Ukraine, if they had Russian tax collectors that actively went around to Ukrainian citizens to do taxes. Now, not every year. I'm talking about every day. If you go out and you work and you get $20, then the Russian tax collector wants 2 or 3. Or maybe he hasn't collected any of the day and he was, drinking vodka at the pub. Maybe he wants all 20 because he's got to make his quota. That is as close to as close of an example I can come up with what Matthew was in the eyes of the Jews. More than that, he had sold out the Jews. He had literally had to turn away from the Jews and say, you are no more, I am now a Roman. Which is really a big deal when you start thinking about the family of Matthew, because his work of life would have been, he would have been educated by his dad to do a specific job. And his dad, if he was the firstborn child especially, would have trained him, and then when the dad passed on, his job was to take care of his mother and all of his sisters until they were married off. That was his job. So for Matthew to turn away things must have been very, very bad for Matthew to be able to drop everything and then go with the enemy and then take taxes on his people. So, a very bad situation, at least. I put some other things about Matthew. Obviously, he was called Levi. He was a tax collector. He was called by Jesus. I love it. We'll probably talk about this. Jesus says, "Come," and Matthew goes, "Okay." It didn't take much for him to realize. The other interesting thing about Matthew is when Jesus comes, Matthew doesn't invite his family to the feast, to the supper. Who does he invite? Other tax collectors. Why does he only invite other tax collectors? Because he's been ostracized by his people. I mean, it's a very easy thing. And we think about it and go, oh, well, he invited his friends. He didn't have anybody else. Again, when we talk about the color of the New Testament, the color of the New Testament comes from looking at it as a first century's perspective. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that all the tax collectors were Jewish?
I don't know. It's a good question.
It makes me think, well, the Jewish people know the other Jews as well.
Right. Oh, yeah.
They didn't live in big metropolis.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably had tax collectors who knew everybody, and
Oh, yeah.
so those other tax collectors were in the same boat that Luke probably was. I'm sorry. That Matthew.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard to, it would be, I can't explain it, George would probably have a better perspective on, the Ukrainian-Russian thing than I do. I mean, we can't imagine giving up everything to go to the other side against our own people. It doesn't happen. We don't have that kind of pressure that Matthew did. Matthew is a great book. Now, Matthew was written specifically to the Jews. So that's very important. It is a Jewish author writing to a Jewish people. And what Matthew is doing is he is providing the authority that Jesus is the Messiah. No question about it. The book was not written for the Gentiles. The reason we know it wasn't written for the Gentiles is because Matthew talks about as it was written. And he uses, and I think I'll get it to the next slide, so I won't spoil that. But Matthew uses a lot of quotes from Isaiah and Zechariah and Malachi throughout his book. And that is his way of telling the Jewish people, hey, this is the guy. This is the person that you should believe in, that you should follow, that, we're in a different time now. The temple has fallen. It's not coming back. Now this is the guy. This is Jesus. And so Matthew does a great job of doing that. Many people use Matthew as a way, we talk about, talking to our neighbors. Matthew is a great book to do that because it kind of takes you step by step through the path to being a Christian. So here we go, Book of Matthew, the audience, 36 quotes from Isaiah, Zechariah, Malachi, Micah, Psalms, and the book of Deuteronomy. So again, he is really trying, he is pounding it in that, hey, Jews, you should be listening to this. It's proof that Jesus is the Messiah. The quote, for it is written, or something similar to that, the genealogy and the authority. And Matthew was written around 60, 66 AD. Many people think that Matthew had multiple references that he wrote the book on. And I read something interesting this morning. The book of Mark has 666 verses in it. Scholars are able to, in the book of Matthew, are able to relate 600 verses in Matthew relate directly to the verses in Mark. So Matthew tends to be a little bit quicker, and then as a longer read, because that's the way the Jews like, the build up, if you will. Very much different from Western or Gentile where we just like, hey, give me the points, give me the bullet points. The Jews would never do bullet points. So we aren't Jews, if you have any questions. The contents of Matthew follows the life of Christ through from the birth to the ascension, and it's a step-by-step guide that Jesus is the Son of God. So, I was going to ask Johnny or somebody to read the genealogy of Jesus, but I'm just not. I want to maintain my membership here and be in good standing, and I'm afraid if I make somebody read this that I'll be ostracized. So we're not going to do it, but you can read it for yourself. Now, besides that point, the question is, why did Matthew include 4 women in the genealogy?
They were in the direct line of Jesus. And they were, let's see, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth.
Bathsheba. Supposed to be.
They were all controversial women.
They were. Exactly.
Tamar was.
Yeah.
Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth was a Moabite.
Right.
Bathsheba was still in like
Yeah. So why would you? So why would Matthew include 4 women of ill repute, if you will?
sure that he could say that.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, we all know that Solomon was so happy when God's promise was going to be lived through one of his descendants, right? And so, I mean, it's not so much that Matthew had a choice. I mean, yes, he listed these women specifically, but they were just in the bloodline between Solomon and Mary.
So that's a good answer, and I think we're on it. It's very Mr. Allen back there.
You got to remember too, in this time, that women were not considered important. It said were 2 or 3 witnesses, and the witnesses could not be women.
Exactly.
Women were considered property. They were not considered of importance. They weren't even allowed to serve anywhere.
Right.
In any capacity. So to include them in goes to show you the scope and power of God to make sure that this is written in such a way that nobody can say this is some sort of slanted version or my political agenda or whatever. They are included in it to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that they are inspired to write what they write.
So those are all very good points. The only thing that I would say, and my favorite uncle-in-law is correct. Matthew's genealogy is different from most anybody else's because most don't list, none of them that I can find list any women at all. So that there has to be something special about these 3 or 4 other than that they were just, like I said before, of ill repute. If it was about women, then he would have included all the other mothers that were of good moral standing, if you will, in this. So we're going to come back to this in just a minute. We don't have time to read. Well, I guess we do. Johnny, would you read this for us? Matthew 1, 18 through 25.
Matthew 1, 18 through 25. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, and he will save his people from their sins. So all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and they called his name Jesus.
So, a lot to unpack in here about, first century stuff. So, one of the things that really amazes me about this, about Joseph and with Mary, is that they never mention the family. One of the, maybe not so much they don't mention Mary's family, but they don't mention Joseph's family. And so you have to ask, in one of the things that I've learned, looking at Jewish context is you don't look at what's being said, you look at what's not being said. So, where's Joseph's family? They would have gone to, if he had been, they would have gone together. We see, that family, that hospitality of the Jews is throughout the Old Testament. I mean, for goodness sake, Lot is willing to give up his virgin daughters for the mob, protect 3 guys. And Joseph doesn't have a family to go with him. So there's something up there. The other thing that's unique about Jewish weddings is that this betrothal would have happened, and then Joseph would have worked up to probably a year to do the house, to get the things in order, to save money up for the dowry, all these different things, and then they would have gone through a formal wedding ceremony. So this is not like, our engagement today, or, I guess it maybe kind of is. I mean, I didn't have to, when I married Shelley, I didn't have to give any goats or cows away, so that was a good thing, because after that I was broke, and I've been broke ever since. But they would have had to really work, and then when they got married, they would have probably lived in his father's home for some period of time, and then made that transition. So anyway, that's a little bit about the betrothal. But the other thing, and this, if I don't know how many of you really know me to know this, but you're going to find this out. I hate nativity scenes. I think nativity scenes are the most. I hate them. They are wrong in every sense of the way they're wrong. There is nothing beautiful about being born in a manger. There are things on the floor that I can't say in church that smell. There's dung on the floor. They smell. You have animals that smell. There are fleas. There are diseases. There are all these different things. And the Son of God, because is being born in a manger. And so there's nothing beautiful about that. The birth story is not the story of a king. So what we've looked at is we have in genealogy, we have 4 women who are not, they are not godly women. Ruth, you could argue, but she was a Moabite. She wasn't a Jew. So, it is what it is. So you have 4 women that are in the genealogy that are not Jewish proper women. You have a birth story that happens in a manger, in a barn. Steve May, if he's here, he could probably tell us what it smells like. It doesn't smell good. It's not a pleasant experience. We have Matthew and Mary. We never know anything about their family. And one of the big things, one of the things of the Jews was hospitality. And open your home. Regardless, if I got to kick the rest of the family out to house 3 people, let's do it. It's no problem. What I believe the book of Matthew is about, and we're going to talk about this over the next 3 weeks, is Matthew was written by, or the book of Matthew was written by an outcast to an outcast people about an outcast Savior. That's what the book of Matthew is about. Matthew wasn't accepted on any terms. The Jewish people were not accepted on any terms. And Jesus was not accepted on any terms. So what we're going to discuss starting next week, and I've done a little bit this week, but we're really going to get into a number of different scriptures, and we're going to look at those scriptures from a first century perspective and really add some color to those. And we're going to talk about them. And I think it'll be an interesting discussion. I am 1 minute over time, so that's good. I appreciate your attention, and let's get ready to worship. Thank you.
Jesus.